A printer's hands shake as he sets metal type in the dim light of a Philadelphia workshop. Outside, January snow falls on streets emptied by curfew. The document he composes will make him a traitor by morning. In Boston Harbor, salt water still stains the docks where men dressed as Mohawks dumped 45 tons of tea 3 years ago. In Virginia, a plantation owner writes by candlelight, crossing out words, starting again, knowing that his signature will mean his death if the rebellion fails. Across 13 colonies, men gather in secret rooms, in churches, in taverns, making a choice that cannot be undone. The summer of 1776 is coming, and with it, a declaration that will split the world in two. 5 years before, the colonies exist in a state of comfortable contradiction. In the counting houses of New York, the merchants wear English wool and drink English tea while complaining about English taxes. Their account books record transactions that span an empire: molasses from Jamaica, indigo from South Carolina, finished goods from Liverpool. The same ships that carry lumber to London return with furniture and books, binding the colonies to the mother country through 10,000 threads of commerce and culture. In the Shenandoah Valley, German farmers plow fields their families have worked for 2 generations. They speak little English, care nothing for parliamentary politics, but they prosper under British protection. Their wheat feeds the coastal cities. Their children marry into Scots-Irish families pushing westward into Cherokee territory. At night, they sleep under roofs of their own making, on land they believe is theirs by right of labor. Charleston's elite gather in homes modeled after English country estates, though the heat and humidity mock any pretense of recreating Surrey or Kent. Enslaved Africans serve dishes that blend Caribbean spices with European recipes. In the parlors, planters' sons who studied law at the Inns of Court debate John Locke and Montesquieu. They quote Enlightenment philosophy about natural rights while their wealth rests on the absolute denial of those same rights to the people who work their rice fields. In Boston, apprentices carry buckets of oysters through cobblestone streets where Puritan churches still define the rhythm of the week. The harbor fills each morning with fishing boats and merchant vessels. Sailors from a dozen nations drink in the waterfront taverns. The town feels more connected to London than to the frontier settlements 200 miles west, where families live in log cabins and the closest book is often the only book, a Bible carried from the old country. This world hums with prosperity and tension, loyalty and resentment. It is a world that believes itself stable. It is already breaking apart. The crack begins not with gunfire, but with paper. The 7 Years' War has left Britain victorious and bankrupt. In London, King George III and his ministers face a debt of £140 million and the cost of garrisoning 10,000 troops along the American frontier. The solution seems obvious: make the colonies pay for their own defense. They benefit from British protection. They should contribute to British expenses. Parliament passes the Stamp Act in 1765. Every legal document, not a newspaper, diploma, even playing cards must carry an embossed revenue stamp. The tax is smaller than what Londoners pay, but it violates a principle Americans have absorbed like mother's milk: no taxation without representation. In Boston, a mob burns the stamp distributor's house. In New York, merchants organize boycotts. In Virginia, a young lawyer named Patrick Henry stands before the House of Burgesses and speaks words that sound dangerously close to treason. Parliament repeals the Stamp Act but immediately passes the Declaratory Act, asserting its right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The words contain everything that follows. If Parliament has absolute authority, then Americans have no rights except those Parliament chooses to grant. If Americans possess rights that government cannot violate, then Parliament's authority cannot be absolute. There is no middle ground. One side must bend or both sides must break. The taxes continue. Duties on glass, lead, paint, paper, tea. In 1770, British soldiers fire into a Boston crowd, killing 5 men. The bodies lie in the snow while blood pools between cobblestones. Samuel Adams and his allies transform the Boston Massacre into propaganda, though a jury of colonists will acquit most of the soldiers. Truth matters less than the story people choose to believe. 3 years later, Parliament grants the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in America. The tax is tiny, but the principle is total. On a December night in 1773, men disguised as Mohawks board 3 ships in Boston Harbor. They work for hours. They're methodically splitting open 342 chests and dumping 45 tons of tea into the water. The harbor smells like a giant teapot for weeks. King George III decides that Massachusetts must be punished. Parliament passes what Americans call the Intolerable Acts. Boston's port closes until the tea is paid for. Massachusetts's charter is revoked. Town meetings are banned. British soldiers can be quartered in private homes. General Thomas Gage arrives with 4 regiments to enforce order, but order is already impossible. The attempt to restore it will destroy everything Britain hopes to preserve. In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies meet in Philadelphia. They call themselves a Continental Congress, though they have no legal authority to exist. Carpenter's Hall fills with men who have never met, representing colonies that often view each other as rivals or strangers. John Adams of Massachusetts sits near Christopher Gadsden of South Carolina. They share a language and an ocean, but their worlds could hardly be more different. They draft a petition to the king. They organize boycotts. They agree to meet again if necessary. Most still hope for reconciliation. But in Massachusetts, farmers begin drilling on village greens. They call themselves Minutemen, ready to fight at a minute's notice. They stockpile gunpowder in barns and church basements. General Gage knows what they are doing. He cannot allow it to continue. On April 18, 1775, 700 British soldiers march from Boston toward Concord, where spies have reported a cache of military supplies. Paul Revere and William Dawes ride ahead, spreading the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm. By dawn, 70 militiamen stand on Lexington Green, blocking the road. Major John Pitcairn orders them to disperse. Someone fires. Within minutes, 8 Americans lie dead on grass, still wet with dew. The British march on to Concord, destroy what supplies remain, then begin the long walk back to Boston. But the countryside has awakened. From behind stone walls and trees, from windows and barns, farmers fire at the column of redcoats. The British run the last miles, exhausted and bleeding. By nightfall, 73 British soldiers are dead, 200 wounded. American casualties are half that number. The war has begun, though neither side yet admits it. 2 months later, militia forces occupy the hills overlooking Boston. General Gage decides to dislodge them before they can fortify. On June 17th, British regulars attack Breed's Hill in 3 waves. Americans hold their fire until the redcoats are 50 yards away, then unleash volleys that cut down entire ranks. The British take the hill on the 3rd assault, but at a cost of over 1,000 casualties. The Americans lose half that many. The victory is hollow. Britain has learned that this will not be a simple police action against rebellious farmers. In Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress assembles. They create a Continental Army and appoint George Washington as its commander. He rides north to take command of the militia surrounding Boston. He is a tall, quiet man who served in the last war against France. He owns slaves and hundreds of acres in Virginia. He has everything to lose, so he goes anyway. The year 1775 ends with both sides preparing for a conflict neither wanted. In London, the king declares the colonies in rebellion. In America, Tom Paine publishes Common Sense, 47 pages that transform the argument. Independence is no longer unthinkable. It becomes inevitable. January 1776. Washington's army freezes outside Boston while British ships resupply the garrison. In North Carolina, Loyalists and Patriots fight each other at Moore's Creek Bridge. The Civil War within the Revolution has begun. Neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. In towns across the colonies, committees of safety enforce boycotts and punish Loyalists with tar and feathers, violence disguised as patriotism. In Philadelphia, delegates debate in closed sessions. Independence has powerful advocates: Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Richard Henry Lee. But many hesitate. Pennsylvania's John Dickinson argues for one more petition to the king. Others fear the social upheaval that revolution might unleash. If Parliament's authority is rejected, what prevents the mob from rejecting all authority? Outside the chamber, the decision is already being made. In June, Virginia's convention instructs its delegates to propose independence. On June 7th, Richard Henry Lee rises to make the motion. 4 weeks of debate follow. John Adams speaks for independence with a passion that even his enemies admire. Edward Rutledge of South Carolina demands that any declaration condemn the slave trade, a position dripping with irony from a man whose wealth rests on slave labor. The task of drafting falls to Thomas Jefferson, a 33-year-old plantation owner who writes with the clarity of a lawyer and the rhythm of a poet. He works in rented rooms, writing and rewriting. His draft blames King George for every grievance, including slavery, a passage that will be deleted to satisfy Georgia and South Carolina. What remains is a radical statement that all men are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights, and that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. On July 2nd, 12 delegations vote for independence. New York abstains, waiting for instructions. On July 4th, Congress adopts Jefferson's declaration with revisions. Church bells ring across Philadelphia. Crowds gather to hear the document read aloud. In New York, soldiers tear down a statue of King George III and melt it into bullets. But independence declared is not independence won. On Long Island, General William Howe lands 20,000 British and Hessian troops, the largest expeditionary force Britain has ever sent overseas. Washington has fewer than 20,000 men, most poorly trained, many without shoes. The British attack on August 27th. In a single day, they kill or capture over 1,000 Americans. Washington retreats to Manhattan, then to White Plains, then across New Jersey. By December, his army is dissolving. Men desert. Enlistments expire. The revolution appears to be collapsing. On Christmas night, Washington leads 2,400 men across the ice-choked Delaware River. They march 9 miles through sleet and snow to attack Trenton at dawn. The Hessian garrison, recovering from Christmas celebrations, surrenders after a brief fight. A week later, Washington strikes again at Princeton. The victories are small, but their effect is enormous. The revolution survives. The war grinds on for 7 more years, But 1776 remains the hinge upon which everything turns. The world that emerges from these months is unrecognizable to the one that entered them. In Paris, Benjamin Franklin arrives as ambassador from a nation that barely exists, wearing a fur cap and plain clothes, presenting himself as the American natural man. He charms the French court into an alliance that will doom British hopes. Across the former colonies, state constitutions are written, most beginning with declarations of rights. Property requirements for voting are lowered, though not eliminated. Slavery continues, the Revolution's great moral failure, though some northern states begin gradual emancipation. Women who managed farms and businesses during the war find themselves pushed back into legal invisibility. The promise of equality remains partial, a promissory note that future generations will struggle to redeem. In London, Parliament debates how an empire lost 13 colonies. Some blame the king's stubbornness. Others blame the colonists' ingratitude. Few grasp that they witnessed the first successful colonial rebellion against a European power, a model that will inspire revolutions on every continent. The physical scars fade slowly. Farms burned during the war are rebuilt. Loyalists who fled to Canada or Britain try to make new lives in exile. In Charleston and Savannah, the plantation economy resumes, feeding British and European markets that care nothing about how their cotton and rice are produced. Enslaved people who fought for the British in exchange for promises of freedom discover that promises mean little when empires calculate their interests. In the Ohio Valley, indigenous nations realize too late that American independence means the end of British restraints on westward expansion. The war between colonists and empire is over. The war between settlers and native peoples accelerates. The American Revolution in 1776 is not a clean narrative of liberty triumphant. It is a complicated, contradictory, often ugly story of people making irrevocable choices under impossible pressure. They create a republic based on principles they do not fully apply. They speak of rights while denying them. They demand freedom while holding others in bondage. But the idea they set loose cannot be contained by their failures to embody it. The declaration that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, that people possess rights no authority can legitimately violate, these claims reshape political possibility. They make revolution thinkable in France, in Haiti, in Latin America, eventually around the world. 2.5 centuries later, the promises of 1776 remain unfinished business. The contradictions the founders could not resolve, between stated ideals and lived reality, between liberty for some and oppression of others, still define the American experiment. Every generation must choose whether to expand the circle of who counts as equal or to defend the boundaries that privilege creates. The farmer's wife standing in her Pennsylvania doorway, watching those riders pass in the pre-dawn darkness, I could not know she was witnessing the birth of something unprecedented. She knew only that the world she understood was ending. What would replace it remained to be written, by her children and grandchildren, by those they would enslave, and those who would fight for freedom, by immigrants who had not yet arrived, and citizens who had not yet been born. The question 1776 asked is the question every generation must answer. Who deserves the rights we claim for ourselves? I'm watching the past so we can understand the present, until the next era.